Hominin evolution in Europe was not a peaceful, boring process of very slow change over time. Long before classic Neanderthals walked Ice Age Europe, a different kind of human dominated the landscape. The Heidelbergian clans, extremely robust, powerful, and in many ways surprisingly sophisticated. These early inhabitants, commonly gathered under the label of Homo Heidelbergensis, were the lords of Europe for some 300,000 years, ruling a land of fire and ice with a mixture of ingenuity and brute strength. Their world is preserved at places like Bilzingsleben, Vertesolos, and Tautavel, where their tools, bones, campsites and hearths still lie waiting for those who know how to read them. And yet, as we examine their remains and reconstruct their lives, a central question looms over the entire inquiry. Did the Neanderthals descend from these ancient Europeans through a long, unbroken chain of local evolution, or did a new population migrate to Europe from the east and replace or absorb them, leaving behind a veneer of continuity where in fact there had been several episodes of upheaval and transformation? The answer is far from settled, for the Middle Pleistocene was a time of profound ecological instability, dramatic climatic reversals, and extraordinary geological upheavals, all of which could have produced both evolution and replacement on a scale difficult for us to fathom today. On the French Riviera, high on a cliff, in the limestone chamber of Arago Cave, lived the Tautavel man, the barbarian titan of France. Their bones, dated between 550,000 and 400,000 years ago, reveal a population whose strength, stature and robustness were remarkable even by Pleistocene standards. The leg bones of Tautavel man resemble in their thickness and curvature those of later Neanderthals, and indicate a muscularity difficult for modern humans to imagine. Males stood around 6 feet tall and carried roughly 220 pounds of solid muscle. Their brows were sharply delineated, their foreheads receded, their jaws were powerful and thick. The skulls, reconstructed from the Arago 21 and 47 specimens, resemble an archaic Homo sapiens in some aspects rather than a pure Homo erectus, creating an intriguing link in the chain of development between early archaic humans and the later Neanderthals. The Tautavel man possessed a brain of roughly 1,250 cubic centimetres, equivalent in Victorian reckoning to about 2.5 pints of Carlsberg beer, or some 16,876 grains of water. In dried millet seed, the brain cavity amounted to 37 ounces in British apothecaries' weight. Such archaisms in measurement, used by early anthropologists, do not in any way detract from the startling realization that the people of the Heidelberg phase had brains nearly as large as ours and bodies of tremendous power. Their tools show signs of use wear consistent with hafting, suggesting they attach stone points to sticks with adhesive substances to form composite tools or short-hafted implements for scraping, carving or engraving. Some stones show evidence of drilling, a curious motion that implies they bored holes in some material now lost to time. Other tools were clearly designed for softening and depressing hides, a process essential for the creation of clothing at a latitude where winter temperatures could kill the unprotected within hours. If Heidelberg man made hafted obsidian knives, as some findings from other sites imply, then the technological sophistication of these early Europeans may have reached heights not traditionally associated with them. Indeed, if they were already approaching the threshold of modern tool-making, the boundary between primitive and advanced becomes less rigid, and the question of whether Neanderthals arose from such populations becomes more nuanced. The tools, hearths and shelters discovered in Germany, Hungary and France, in combination with the bones of Tautavel man, offer a composite portrait of a widespread, technologically capable and physically formidable human population that thrived throughout Europe during the Heidelbergian period. The archaeological evidence from Bilzingsleben, Germany, reveals a people who were at once primitive and surprisingly sophisticated. Excavations at the site uncovered a partial cranium, classified by some scholars as belonging to a very early form of the Heidelbergian clan, alongside an arrangement of large stones that appear to have formed the foundations of wooden structures or temporary shelters. These hominins evidently possessed the foresight to create an organized campsite, to wield fire with confidence, and to fashion wooden throwing and thrusting spears with sharpened, fire-hardened tips. Bilzingsleben man, described by one German anthropologist as having a visage that must have appeared unusually savage and brutal owing to their massive brows and archaic facial contours, nevertheless demonstrated a degree of craftsmanship and planning that belies such dismissive characterizations. Several engraved bone fragments hint at behavior that cannot be easily explained by mere practicality, and the careful layout of stones and hearths suggests a population capable of returning to the same settlement repeatedly and rebuilding it as needed. If such people were truly the ancestral stock of Neanderthals, their achievements must be recognized as forming the first chapter of a long developmental sequence. Further east, the Vertiszolos fossil site in Hungary presents another portrait of early Europeans whose daily lives revolved around fire, flint, and the ceaseless effort to survive in an unforgiving environment. Here, archaeologists discovered hearths that confirm control of fire, Acheulean and early Levallois tools that demonstrate both tradition and innovation in stoneworking, and a fragmentary skull that stands as mute testimony to the presence of human life in a region subject to severe climatic swings. Burnt bones and carefully shaped flakes indicate that these hominins processed food and hides with a precision that implies deep familiarity with their tools and materials. They engraved marks on bones whose purpose remains unclear, though their very presence reminds us that the cognitive world of these people was not as barren or mechanical as earlier scholarship once assumed. The inhabitants of Vertiszolos, like those of Bilzingsleben, belonged to the great Heidelbergian stock that dominated Europe during the middle stages of the Pleistocene, and they too could plausibly have contributed to the eventual rise of Neanderthals. And they lived through hell. This period itself was marked by dramatic climatic oscillations and repeated catastrophes that shaped the evolutionary landscape in complex ways. The second interglacial, known as the Anglian interglacial, created conditions warm enough for Britain to be inhabited, presenting a Europe of forests, rivers, and abundant game. But the Anglian glaciation that followed forced populations to flee or perish as sheets of ice swept over the north and central regions. The land bridges that linked Britain to the continent emerged and vanished with the tides of glacial and interglacial cycles, creating pathways for migration and then sealing them off again. Compounding these challenges was an epoch of extraordinary volcanic activity. The Somma Vesuvius volcanic complex in Italy roared into life around 400,000 years ago, while the Roccamonfina volcano experienced catastrophic collapse, filling the landscape with ash and forming a caldera with a temporary volcanic lake. In the Aegean, the early stages of the Santorini volcano began to rise above the sea, presaging the explosive events that would reshuffle civilization hundreds of thousands of years later. The people of the Heidelbergian world walked through volcanic landscapes whose ash preserved their footprints, as at Roccamonfina, where hominin tracks suggest familiarity with the terrain and perhaps even an adaptive advantage in exploiting nutrient-rich post-eruption environments. Among these shifting landscapes, Italy appears to have served as a crucial refuge. The Caprano skull, discovered in central Italy and dated to approximately 400,000 years ago, suggests a hominin population that weathered the worst of the climatic instability by remaining in the peninsula's comparatively temperate environment. Acheulean tools found nearby reinforce this impression of continuity. The skull, however, is distinct in morphology, standing somewhat apart from both the Neanderthal lineage and the more archaic European populations, and raising the intriguing possibility that Italy harboured a separate or partially isolated branch of humanity during this period. In such refugia, populations could have persisted through glacial winters, only to expand northward and westward when the climate improved, perhaps even intermingling with other groups or contributing to the emerging Neanderthal lineage. Even more significant, however, is a site buried deep within the Atapuerca Mountains of Spain. There, in a pit at the bottom of a deep cave shaft, the remains of at least 28 individuals were deposited, creating what may be one of the earliest examples of intentional mortuary behavior among hominins. These bones, dated to roughly 430,000 years ago, exhibit distinct Neanderthal features, especially in the shape of the face, jaw and brow region, a process known as Neanderthalization. This is the smoking gun for the Europe-born Neanderthal hypothesis. In fact, nuclear DNA extracted from the fossils reveals a genetic lineage that is firmly rooted in the Neanderthal branch of the human family. This evidence has been heralded as a decisive demonstration that Neanderthals arose in Europe, evolving directly from populations like those from Spain rather than being introduced from outside the continent. As a result, name Homo Heidelbergensis is now restricted to the European pre-Neanderthal lineage only. Yet the matter is far from settled, because the fossil record of Europe during this period is extraordinarily diverse, with some populations showing strong Neanderthal affinities, and others looking distinctly archaic, almost as though Europe were home to several parallel human species existing simultaneously. However, another enigmatic skull is the Steinheim cranium of Germany, also dated to around 400,000 years, which morphologically clusters with skulls from East rather than with Neanderthals or Heidelbergians, even when accounting for the fact that it is likely female. Such diversity opens the door to a more complex interpretation of human evolution. It is entirely plausible that Europe gave rise to early Neanderthal forms, while at the same time receiving new populations from outside the continent who contributed additional traits or replaced local populations. Fossils from this region show a pattern of occupation and replacement that hints at waves of movement, perhaps driven by climatic shifts, resource pressures, or volcanic disasters farther afield. If a population from Western Asia, already possessing some proto-Neanderthal traits, entered Europe during one of these windows of accessibility, it might have interbred with local Heidelbergian groups or supplanted them entirely, leaving behind a genetic and morphological signature that later emerged fully in the classic Neanderthals of the last ice age. The most parsimonious explanation, therefore, may be a synthesis of the two major theories. Europe likely fostered the early development of Neanderthal characteristics, but the continent may also have received additional hominin populations from the East that accelerated, modified, or even redirected that evolutionary path. The Heidelbergian clans undoubtedly contributed to the Neanderthal lineage, but they may not have been its sole ancestors. Instead, Europe during the Middle Pleistocene may have hosted a braided stream of human populations, some local, some arriving from elsewhere, whose interwoven destinies culminated in the emergence of the Neanderthal as we know him. As we examine the tools, bones, shelters, hearths and footprints of the Heidelbergian clans, it becomes clear that they were not passive forerunners awaiting replacement by a superior species. They were themselves powerful, intelligent, and extraordinarily resilient. Whether they gave rise to the Neanderthals or were partly replaced by them, their achievements stand as remarkable testaments to human endurance in a world shaped by fire, ice, and relentless change. Thanks for watching.